Stop pretending you have money, Darius. You're embarrassing us.
By the time my wife slapped the card out of my hand, she had already told a banker I was too broke to understand the deal. Stop pretending you have money. Darius, Camille said as the metal card rang against marble. Then the regional president crossed the lounge, ignored the man beside her, and asked me, Mr. Cole, should legal freeze the $3 million package that names your holding company? Every head near us seemed to turn at once. Evelyn Grant was not a teller. She ran Commonwealth Meridian's Southeast Private Bank and had reviewed my family office for years. Camille stared at her, then at me, as if one of us had changed languages. She had come expecting my signature on a harmless witness page. She did not yet know whose balance sheet had been used to keep the deal alive. Preston Vale, the man standing beside my wife with his hand resting too comfortably at the small of her back, stopped smiling. He had spent the previous hour explaining to everyone within reach how people with real capital never carried ordinary cards. I picked mine up, wiped the edge with my thumb, and asked Evelyn one question. Which file is legal waiting on? Evelyn's eyes moved toward the leather folder under Preston's arm. The Maison Vale credit package, she said. Compliance escalated it because Cole Meridian Holdings is named as a support party without verified authorization. Camille had told me we were here because a spouse needed to witness paperwork. That sentence made clear the bank had been told something very different for weeks. If you had asked Camille that morning what Cole Meridian Holdings was, she would have said it was the little consulting LLC I used to invoice property inspections. She did not know it owned 14 commercial buildings, 3 logistics yards, 2 data center sites, and a controlling stake in the private credit fund reviewing the loans she and Preston were trying to close. My name is Darius Cole. I was 42 that spring, and most people in Atlanta knew me, if they knew me at all, as a facilities consultant who drove an 8-year-old Lexus, wore shirts without visible labels, and spent too much time walking construction sites with a yellow legal pad. That description was not false. It was simply smaller than the whole truth. The whole truth was that I founded Cole Meridian after buying a burned-out warehouse with money from a demolition contract nobody else wanted. 20 years later, the company held real estate, infrastructure, and private credit assets worth just over $300 million. My personal share sat inside trusts and holding companies that kept my name out of glossy magazines and social pages. I did not hide because I was ashamed of money. I hid because I learned early how quickly money can rearrange affection. When my father, Leon, received a construction settlement after an injury, relatives who had barely called began arriving with emergencies and business ideas. 2 years later, the money was almost gone, but the lesson stayed. Attention becomes unreliable when people think your balance belongs in their plans. What stayed with me was not the lost money. It was the way my father's shoulders changed. He had spent his life being treated like a man who needed help. Then for 2 years, he was treated like a door everyone wanted opened. When the money disappeared, so did half the people who had called him brother. He told me never to confuse attention with love. When I met Camille, I believed I had found someone who made that lesson unnecessary. She was producing small brand events then, running on coffee and nerve, carrying garment bags through hotel kitchens while executives twice her age called her sweetheart. She laughed at rich people who needed their names printed on menus and said the best room was the one where nobody had to announce who mattered. We got married 9 years later in a courtyard behind a neighborhood jazz club. There were no magazine photographers, no luxury sponsors, and no family office attorney standing near the cake. Camille knew my consulting business was comfortable, knew I owned our home without a mortgage, and knew I invested. She did not know the scale because I never offered it. And she never pressed. For the first few years, that felt less like secrecy than privacy. We cooked late dinners after her events. She would sit on the kitchen counter in stocking feet while I explained why a cracked loading dock could ruin a warehouse lease. She would tell me which client had tried to move a centerpiece 10 minutes before doors opened. We were ordinary together, and I trusted ordinary. Then Camille's work changed. She landed a luxury hospitality account, then another, and began spending evenings in rooms where every watch, table assignment, and vacation story carried a hidden ranking. She learned the names of private clubs I had spent years avoiding. She started calling our quiet house safe, with the tone people use when safe has become an insult. At first, the changes were small. She replaced the car she loved because a client joked that it looked like something an assistant would drive. She stopped wearing a gold bracelet my mother had given her because it was too sentimental. She began introducing me as Darius. He does building maintenance consulting, then turning toward someone richer before I could finish a sentence. I noticed. I also made excuses. Ambition can look ugly in the middle because growth is rarely graceful. I told myself she was learning a new professional language and would eventually remember her own. Instead, the language became a value system. People were no longer interesting to Camille because of what they cared about. They were useful according to what they could unlock. Preston Vale entered that system perfectly. He called himself a hospitality developer, though most of his projects existed in renderings, press releases, and rooms he had leased for launch parties. He wore custom suits, rented exotic cars for weekends, and used the phrase capital stack so often that people assumed he must have one. Camille found him impressive before I ever met him. The first time she brought Preston to dinner, he spent 20 minutes explaining commercial real estate to me. He told me debt was about confidence, not collateral, and that banks were becoming story-driven. I asked which lenders he preferred. He named two funds Cole Meridian had stopped working with because their underwriting was sloppy. He did not notice when I went quiet. After dinner, I asked Camille what she knew about him. She rolled her eyes and said not every successful man needed to be interrogated like a leaking roof. He thinks bigger than you. She added. It was the first time she said the sentence. It would not be the last. I did not argue. I asked my chief investment officer to run a standard public record review the next morning. The report was not dramatic enough to make an easy villain. Preston had no criminal record and no single scandal that would let me dismiss him with a label. What he had was a pattern, ventures launched on borrowed credibility, disputed disclosures, leased assets presented as symbols of ownership, and partners who believed commitments were firmer than the documents actually said. In business, patterns matter before headlines do. I kept the report to myself. That decision matters because I could have ended the story earlier. I could have laid the documents on the kitchen table and told Camille exactly who Preston was. Instead, I convinced myself that exposing him would turn me into a jealous husband trying to win with information she could not independently verify. I wanted her to choose clearly without my thumb on the scale. What I did not understand was that Camille had already started choosing. She came home later, guarded her phone more carefully, and began talking about a concept called Maison Vale, a members-only hospitality studio that would combine private dining, brand launches, and boutique lodging. Preston had the vision. She said. She had the relationships. What they needed was serious financing. I asked how much. She said $3 million as if she were mentioning the price of dinner. I asked what equity they were contributing. She said the bank cared more about growth projections. I asked which bank. She smiled for the first time that week and said Commonwealth Meridian. Because Preston knew people at the top. I almost laughed. But something in her face stopped me. Commonwealth Meridian was not my bank in the ordinary sense. Cole Meridian's private credit arm owned 31% of a holding company that had become the bank's largest non-institutional shareholder after a restructuring 4 years earlier. I had no role in branch operations, but our family office kept substantial deposits there, and I chaired the credit advisory board for large commercial exposures. I could have told Camille right then. Instead, I asked who at the bank they were working with. She said a vice president named Graham Sykes and told me not to get intimidated by the title. Just answer what they ask and don't volunteer anything weird about your little company. She said, this meeting matters. The words sat between us longer than she realized. 2 days before the appointment, Camille asked for copies of our tax returns. I told her our accountant would send the household filings directly because several schedules were confidential under partnership agreements. She stared at me and said, Of course they are. Then she muttered something about men who hide behind paperwork when they do not want their wives to know they are broke. That night, I found an ivory envelope in my desk with Camille's name written on it. I had prepared it 3 weeks earlier for our anniversary. Inside was a letter granting her the right to lease. For $1 a year. A restored storefront in a building I owned on Edgewood Avenue. Years ago. Before Maison Vale. She had dreamed of opening a creative studio for young event designers. I had renovated the space quietly after one of our late-night kitchen conversations came back to me. Polished concrete. High ceilings. A teaching kitchen. 2 offices. And enough room for workshops. I had planned to give her the keys at dinner after the bank meeting. I thought supporting the dream she had before Preston might remind us both of who we had been. On the morning of the appointment, I put the envelope in the inside pocket of my jacket. Camille came downstairs in a cream suit I had never seen, looked at my charcoal blazer, and asked if I owned anything that did not make me look like an insurance adjuster. I told her I was comfortable. She said comfort was the problem and walked out before I could answer. We drove separately because she said she and Preston had another meeting after the bank. When I arrived, his silver coupe was already under the portico. Camille was waiting beside him. He kissed her cheek when I stepped onto the curb. It was quick enough to be deniable and familiar enough that my stomach understood it before my mind finished naming it. Inside, Graham Sykes greeted Preston with the energetic warmth junior bankers use when they want a deal to feel more advanced than it is. Camille introduced me as her husband and added, "He's mostly here for a signature." Graham glanced at my shoes. My watch. Then my face. He did not recognize me. That was normal. My photograph was not on the bank's website. We were shown into the private client lounge because Preston had insisted the meeting needed discretion. Coffee arrived. A leather folder appeared. Graham began reviewing the proposed credit structure. $3 million. 18 months interest only. Secured by equipment. Receivables. And a limited personal support agreement. Then he reached the page where my name appeared. Mr. Cole would provide contingent support through Cole Meridian Holdings, Graham said. I looked at Camille. She looked at the table. Preston immediately began speaking about technical drafting language and how nobody expected the support to be called. I asked who had represented to the bank that Cole Meridian Holdings would stand behind the loan. Graham's expression tightened. He turned a page and pointed to an email summary. The statement had come from Camille's business address. Copying Preston. It said my company was fully aligned with the venture and that I had agreed in principle to provide backstop liquidity. Camille finally looked at me and said, "We were going to explain it today." I asked what fully aligned meant to her. She whispered my name through clenched teeth and told me not to turn a drafting shortcut into a marriage fight. Preston leaned back and said everyone in business used soft commitments to keep underwriting moving. I told him I had spent 20 years in business and had never used someone else's balance sheet without permission. Graham closed the folder. He looked uneasy now. Not because he knew who I was, but because a loan officer understands the difference between an optimistic forecast and a disputed support representation. He said the package could not proceed until the guarantee question was clarified. Camille's jaw tightened. That was when she decided the problem in the room was me. She said I had embarrassed her for years by refusing to act like a man with ambition. She said she had carried every social obligation while I hid behind invoices and job sites. Preston stared at the window. Graham pretended to reorganize papers. I felt the anniversary envelope against my chest and understood that the conversation I had imagined was already gone. Then Camille said the thing that changed the room. Fine. If your company can't support us, at least cover the escrow deposit so we don't lose the property. The amount was $48,000. Graham said the bank could take a card authorization for the initial reserve while wiring instructions were finalized. I reached for my wallet. The card I pulled out was plain brushed metal with no visible tier printed on the front. It was issued through Commonwealth Meridian's family office program and settled against a reserve account used for operating expenses. To anyone who did not know the program, it looked almost aggressively ordinary. I handed it toward Graham. Camille moved faster. Her palm struck my hand. The card hit the marble. spun once, and slid beneath the edge of a low table. "Stop pretending you have money," she said. "You can't save this by maxing out some business card and making us look desperate." A woman reading near the window looked up. Graham froze with his pen halfway to the paper. I did not answer immediately. The card's thin metallic ring seemed to hang in the marble room longer than it should have. My palm stung where Camille struck it. But the sharper sensation was recognizing her expression. She was not embarrassed by what she had done. Only by the possibility I might make the deal harder. I bent down slowly, retrieved the card, and saw Evelyn Grant already crossing the lounge. Evelyn had run Commonwealth Meridian's Southeast Private Bank for 6 years. We had sat through refinancing committees, emergency liquidity calls, and one ugly weekend when a regional lender failed and half the city thought credit markets were about to seize. She knew my face. More importantly, she knew exactly what the brushed metal card in my hand meant. "Mr. Cole," Evelyn said, and Graham stood so quickly his chair scraped the floor. She apologized for interrupting and explained that my scheduled quarterly family office review had been moved upstairs after compliance flagged a commercial file using one of my entities. That was why she was in the building, why she recognized me, and why the timing was not some miraculous coincidence arranged for my benefit. Evelyn continued, "Careful and professional. The Maison Vale request lists Cole Meridian Holdings as a support party, because your private credit entity has exposure to this institution. Compliance routed it for conflict review." She paused. "We cannot process any representation involving your holdings without verified authorization from you." There was no drama in her voice. That made it land harder. Camille asked, "Why would his little consulting company trigger your legal department?" Evelyn looked at me before answering, giving me the chance to stop her. I did not. I had spent years protecting privacy. I was no longer willing to protect a lie that was being used to put my name behind a debt I had never approved. "Cole Meridian Holdings is not a small consulting company," Evelyn said. "It is the parent entity for a diversified investment group and a material stakeholder in our bank holding structure." Graham looked down at the folder in front of him, then back at me. Preston's expression did not collapse. It calculated. That told me more than surprise would have. Camille laughed once, a short sound with no humor in it. She asked what material meant. Evelyn answered only what banking protocol allowed. She said my family office was one of the bank's largest private relationships and that I chaired an advisory committee connected to commercial credit oversight. Then she stopped, because she understood the rest was mine to disclose. I told Camille the number because half-truths had brought us far enough. Cole Meridian managed a little over $300 million in assets, most of it illiquid and held through long-term structures. I owned the controlling interest, the house we lived in, the warehouse portfolio, the private credit fund, and several investments she had heard people brag about at dinners all sat under entities I controlled. Her face emptied. The first emotion was not relief. It was injury. "You let me think you were struggling," she said. I told her I had never said I was struggling. I paid every bill, funded our retirement accounts, supported her career, and told her from the beginning that I kept business structures private. "You filled in the blanks," I said, "and then you punished me for the picture you drew." Preston finally spoke. He said this was actually good news, that a stronger guarantor made the deal cleaner, and that everyone had clearly misunderstood each other. He smiled at me as if we were two professionals who had just discovered a shared interest. I watched him convert my marriage into a financing opportunity in less than 15 seconds. I asked Evelyn whether Cole Meridian's investment team had seen Maison Vale before the bank received it. She said an affiliated fund had reviewed a direct inquiry 6 weeks earlier and declined to proceed. I reminded her that I was recused from individual borrower decisions involving the bank because of our ownership interest. She nodded. The conflict packet contained the fund's documented reasons, not an order from me. Camille asked why I would need privacy from her if the loan was hers. I looked at Graham and told him the bank meeting was over until its compliance team decided what could legally be discussed. Then I turned to Evelyn and asked her to arrange a separate room. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The room had shifted away from performance and toward records. Upstairs, the file was thinner than I expected. Preston had claimed $1 million in sponsor equity. Bank statements showed less than $90,000 in unrestricted cash. The rest was described as committed capital from partners who had not signed binding commitments. One letter of intent came from an entity dissolved 8 months earlier. None of that was fatal by itself. Together, it was a warning. The sharper problem was the property. Maison Vale planned to lease and renovate an old hotel annex on Peachtree Street. Preston had represented that he controlled the site through an exclusive option. He did not. The option had expired 3 weeks before he submitted the credit package, and the owner had already accepted a backup offer. He was asking the bank to finance a deal he no longer controlled. Evelyn placed one final page in front of me. It was Camille's email saying I had agreed to provide backstop liquidity. Beneath it was a calendar invite she had sent me that morning titled CM Bank Witness Signature. No mention of a guarantee. No mention of $3 million. No mention that my company's name had been used for 6 weeks to keep an application alive. I stared at the page longer than I needed to. Money can make betrayal look complicated when it is actually simple. The issue was not that Camille did not know I was wealthy. The issue was that she believed I was poor and still considered my name useful enough to borrow when she needed credibility. Contempt and dependence had somehow learned to live in the same sentence. I asked whether any document bearing my signature had been submitted. Evelyn said no, and I felt a reluctant breath leave my chest. Camille had represented that my support existed before asking me, but she had not forged a signature or altered an executed document. The distinction did not make the betrayal harmless. It simply meant I could judge what had actually happened instead of enlarging it into something the evidence did not support. I instructed Evelyn to remove me and every Cole Meridian entity from the application, then send the file back through normal underwriting without my involvement. I also asked that the credit committee receive a written note confirming I had neither approved nor opposed the loan. If Maison Vale qualified on verified equity, site control, and cash flow, it could proceed. If it failed, the reasons needed to belong to the file, not to my marriage. Evelyn nodded. Then she asked whether I wanted security present when I returned downstairs. I said no. Camille was my wife. Not a threat. Whatever had happened, I would not turn a private bank into a stage for revenge. That answer would matter later, because Preston had already begun telling himself that my restraint was weakness. When I stepped back into the lounge, Camille was standing alone. Preston had moved to the far end, speaking rapidly into his phone. Graham was gone. The card was back in my wallet. The anniversary envelope was still inside my jacket. For the first time all day, I could feel its weight more clearly than the financial documents. Camille asked how long I had been rich. I said that was not the right question. She asked what the right question was. I told her, "How long have you been willing to disrespect me because you thought I wasn't?" Her mouth opened, then closed. The answer was not a date either of us wanted to say out loud. She accused me of testing her. That word hit because part of it was true. Privacy had become a test somewhere along the way. Even if I had never admitted it, I told her I should have disclosed more as our marriage deepened. I should have trusted her with the scale of my life or confronted the fact that I did not. That failure belonged to me. But I did not make you slap my hand. I said, I did not make you use my company's name without permission. I did not make you bring another man into our marriage and ask me to finance the room he wanted to stand in. Camille flinched at the last sentence. Then she asked what I meant about another man. I told her I had seen the kiss outside. She said it was nothing, then looked away before the sentence had even settled. I asked whether there was more. After silence, she admitted the relationship had crossed the line 3 months earlier, though she tried to describe it as something that happened after our marriage was already failing. Hearing the timeline hurt. But at least the room finally contained one truth. Neither of us was negotiating. Preston ended his call and walked back toward us with a different expression. He said the site owner was willing to extend the option if the escrow arrived by 5 o'clock. He looked at me. Not Camille. 48,000 is noise to you. He said, you could protect your wife's reputation and sort out the rest later. I almost admired the efficiency of it. 10 minutes earlier, he had treated me like an obstacle. Now he was asking me to buy time for a deal that had used my name without consent. I told him no, not because 48,000 mattered to me, but because documents mattered, permission mattered, and a business that began by hiding its real capital position from its own lender was already telling us how it would behave. He said I was being emotional. I told him underwriting was the opposite of emotional. Then I asked one question I had wanted to ask since dinner months earlier. How much of the $1 million in sponsor equity is actually yours? His jaw tightened. Camille looked at him. That was the first time I saw doubt move across her face in his direction instead of mine. Preston said his capital was structured through partners. I asked how much cash he personally had committed. He said that was an amateur question. I smiled. Not because anything was funny, but because my father used to say people call a question stupid when the truthful answer is expensive. Preston walked away before I could ask again. Camille followed him 3 steps, then stopped. The movement was small, but it told me everything. A week earlier, she would have followed without thinking. Now she had seen the numbers behind the costume. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt tired. Being right about someone you hope to be wrong about is a poor kind of victory. I reached inside my jacket and took out the ivory envelope. Camille saw her name and froze. I explained that nothing inside had been transferred or signed. It was an anniversary offer built around a future we still shared when I prepared it. The letter proposed a $1 lease on the Edgewood studio and a 5-year operating grant for the creative program she used to dream about before status became the dream itself. She sat down before she finished reading. "You were going to give me this?" she asked. I said yes. The studio was not a trap, not a reward for good behavior, and not a test. It had been a gift to the woman who once stayed up until 2 in the morning helping assistants learn event budgets because nobody had taught them how not to be cheated. Camille pressed the letter flat on her knee. For the first time since the card hit the floor, she cried. Not theatrically. Her shoulders simply folded as if the suit she wore had become too heavy. She said she had convinced herself I lacked ambition because it hurt less than admitting she no longer respected the kind of ambition I had. I wanted that confession to fix something. It did not. Pain does not become healing just because someone finally names it accurately. I told her the Edgewood offer would not be executed because the future it was designed to support had changed before either of us signed it. That was not taking property away from her. It was refusing to create a new gift after trust had collapsed. Then she asked whether I was going to destroy Preston. The question surprised me. I asked why she assumed I would. She said men with power always eventually showed people what it was for. I thought about my father, about the relatives who came when the settlement check arrived, and about the promise I had made to myself not to become the kind of man money had taught him to fear. I'm not going to call his investors. I said, I'm not going to blacklist him. I'm not going to make one phone call that changes his life. I told her the bank already had his documents. His deal would rise or fall on what he had submitted. If facts were enough to hurt him, I did not need to add my hands to the process. By 4 that afternoon, Commonwealth Meridian suspended the Maison Vale application, pending updated proof of site control and verified sponsor equity. The credit committee's written notice cited the expired option and unsupported capital letters. My name did not appear in the decision. At 5, the owner took a backup tenant with approved financing. Preston lost the site to the deadlines and documents he had created, not to a phone call from me. At 6:14, he texted Camille that he needed space. At 7, his publicist posted a photograph of him at an industry dinner with another woman whose family owned a hotel company. I did not show Camille. She found it herself. Some betrayals need no investigator because opportunists are impatient when the door they wanted closes. We drove home separately. I arrived first and sat in the dark kitchen where we had once built so much of our marriage out of cheap takeout and stories from bad workdays. On the counter was a ceramic bowl Camille had made in a beginner pottery class. It leaned slightly to one side. I remembered loving it because the flaw was visible. That night, she came home after 11, and we went through the timeline without raising our voices. The affair had started 3 months earlier. The Maison Vale planning began soon after. Camille admitted she had chosen the bank meeting because she expected me to sign under social pressure rather than risk embarrassing her in front of Preston. That detail hurt differently because it showed the humiliation had not been accidental. She covered her face with both hands. I wanted to comfort her by reflex, and the fact that I still had that reflex made me angrier than anything else had. Love can survive information longer than trust can. I sat with my hands flat on the table until the impulse passed. Then I asked her to sleep in the guest room. The next morning, I called my attorney and asked for a private, orderly separation process. I did not freeze accounts Camille legally used, remove benefits, or involve Cole Meridian staff beyond records counsel requested. My attorney documented every step because restraint is most credible when it can be verified later. I wanted the marriage ended fairly, not transformed into a contest between my resources and her fear. Camille's first response was disbelief. Her second was bargaining. She said we had not even tried counseling. I told her I was willing to attend sessions to understand what happened and end the marriage without cruelty, but not to negotiate my way back into trusting someone who had spent months converting contempt into permission. For 2 weeks, Preston disappeared from her life almost completely. Then a lawsuit filed by one of his former partners became public. It alleged that he had circulated investor materials using non-binding interest letters as though they were committed funds. I learned about it from the business press like everyone else. I had no role in the case and wanted none. Camille called me after the article ran. She asked if I had leaked anything. I said no. She believed me only after Evelyn confirmed through counsel that the bank had not shared its file beyond required internal channels. That moment hurt in a different way. Even after everything, Camille's first instinct was still to imagine my power as a weapon because that was how she had learned to understand power. Our counseling sessions were quiet and brutal. Camille said status had become a way to measure whether her life was moving forward. Each room she entered gave her a new definition of enough, and I kept refusing to perform success in the language those rooms recognized. She turned that discomfort into resentment rather than asking me why I lived the way I did. I admitted my side more plainly than I had at the bank. I had used privacy as armor. Every time Camille became more status conscious, I disclosed less, telling myself I was protecting something pure. In reality, I was avoiding a conversation that might have revealed years earlier that our values were separating. Silence can be dignified. It can also be cowardice in a clean shirt. None of that excused the affair or the loan representation. Both things could be true at once. I had withheld too much, and she had chosen cruelty. Accountability is not a pie where one person's piece makes the other smaller. That realization was one of the few useful things we carried out of counseling. The divorce took 5 months, because most of Cole Meridian predated the marriage and sat inside documented structures. There was less financial warfare than gossip predicted. Camille received what our agreements and state law required. I did not challenge reasonable requests. She did not contest ownership she had once mocked because she finally understood how carefully it had been built. The day the decree became final, Camille asked to meet at the Edgewood building. I almost said no. Then I remembered the envelope and agreed. The storefront was still empty, sunlight falling through the tall front windows onto the polished floor. She stood in the middle of the room and said this was the life she had actually wanted before she started wanting to be seen, wanting something bigger. She apologized without mentioning Preston. Pressure, or my secrecy, that mattered. She said, I humiliated you because I thought your value was the number I had assigned you. She did not ask me to forgive her. She did not ask for the space. For the first time in a long time, she let a sentence end without trying to negotiate what came after. I told her I forgave enough not to carry the bank lobby with me forever. I also told her forgiveness was not the same as return, and distance was not revenge. The door to our marriage was already closed. She cried, nodded, and left the Edgewood studio before I did. I stayed a few minutes longer with the unsigned lease in my briefcase, grieving the future that had existed only on paper. A month later, I changed the plan for the property. The Edgewood space became the Leon Cole Workshop, named for my father. We offered 6-month residencies to small business owners who were good at their craft, and terrible at getting rooms full of capital to take them seriously. No one had to perform wealth to enter. They had to show work, customers, and a plan. The first cohort included a caterer from Decatur, a furniture maker from East Point, a woman who designed uniforms for home health workers, and two brothers building energy monitors for old apartment buildings. None of them arrived in exotic cars. Every one of them brought something more useful than image: receipts, prototype, late invoices, and questions they were not afraid to ask. I started spending Friday mornings there, not as a benefactor giving speeches, but as a man at a folding table reviewing leases and cash flow assumptions. The first time one founder apologized for using a basic debit card to pay for coffee, I laughed harder than I had in months. Then I told him a card is only embarrassing when it belongs to someone else. Commonwealth Meridian later became a funding partner for the workshop, but I insisted the credit standards remain ordinary. No founder received a loan because they had my favor. We helped them understand what lenders actually needed: clean records, honest projections, real equity, and the courage to say when a number was not known yet. Evelyn visited one Friday and brought the brushed metal card I had replaced after the incident. The old one had been bent slightly at the corner when it hit the marble. She had kept it in an evidence sleeve while the bank documented the dispute and asked whether I wanted it destroyed. I told her no. I put it in the top drawer of my desk. Not because I wanted a trophy from the day Camille was humiliated by the truth. I kept it because the bend reminded me how easily people confuse appearance with capacity. The card had looked ordinary, just as I had looked ordinary. Neither fact had required correction until someone tried to use that appearance as permission to treat a person as less. 6 months after the divorce, I saw Camille again at a nonprofit event. She was working, not attending. She had left luxury brand strategy and joined a small arts foundation as operations director. Her clothes were simpler. Her laugh sounded more like the woman I remembered from hotel kitchens. I noticed those things without turning them into a story about redemption. She came over, asked how the workshop was doing, and listened to the answer without mentioning what she had lost. Before she left, she said, "I used to think rich meant never having to explain yourself." I told her I had learned the opposite. The more power you have, the more carefully you owe people an explanation when your choices affect them. Preston's lawsuit settled the following year and his firm dissolved. I learned that from a trade newsletter and felt almost nothing. The satisfying version of this story would say I watched him fall. I did not. Once the marriage ended, he became what the documents had already shown: a man who repeatedly presented borrowed access as owned capacity. The consequences reached him without requiring me to become one of them. The harder lesson was about Camille and me. Secret wealth did not prove I was a good husband, and ignorance of it did not cause her betrayal. She chose contempt when she thought I had less. I chose silence when I feared being valued for more. Her choices were more destructive, but mine still kept truth out of the marriage. Character was revealed by what each of us did when certainty was unavailable. That morning, Cammy said, "Stop pretending you have money." For about 10 seconds, the sentence burned. Then it became smaller than everything around it. I had spent years pretending money was irrelevant to our marriage while quietly keeping its scale behind locked doors. She had spent years making money a measure of worth, in different ways. We had both allowed an unspoken number to occupy too much space between us. The banker walking over did not save me. The balance sheet did not save me. What mattered was refusing to use either one to force a more satisfying ending. I let compliance follow the documents. Let Preston face his own deadlines. Let the marriage end without financial punishment. And let the unused Edgewood space become a workshop for people whose work deserved to be judged on substance instead of costume. If you ever stand in a room where someone has assigned your worth based on what they think you can pay, you do not have to perform wealth to correct them. But the people closest to you do need enough truth to love a real person rather than a silhouette. Privacy can protect dignity. Secrecy, when it becomes a test, can quietly turn intimacy into an examination the other person never agreed to take. And if telling the truth costs you a relationship, pay attention to what the truth revealed before you rush to buy the old version back. Some losses are not proof that you failed. Sometimes they are the price of finally seeing what was already there. I kept the bent card, opened the Leon Cole workshop, stopped hiding behind the word consultant, and went back to work with fewer secrets and a much clearer definition of wealth.